So as we navigate the world, we encounter many different views. You might be walking in a big open field, or maybe you are out at the beach at sunset. And we all know that these pictures never quite capture that scenic experience. There is something really special about being surrounded by the scene that is truly transporting. But when we study the scene perception in a typical fMRI experiment, we are limited to present images only up to 10 to 15 degrees at the center. So often the scene images are cropped or rescaled and presented like some kinds of postcards, which is quite different from how we actually experience the world. And not only they are different kinds of experience, but more theoretically, there could be fundamentally different processing mechanism for the far peripheral visual information. And this could be especially important for understanding the scene perception. So the goals of these projects are, first, to develop an ultra-wide-angle projection method, and to explore the neural scene representation under more immersive viewing conditions. So in this talk, I'm going to first tell you about how we achieve the wide-angle projection at the scanner, and then show you how we use this setup to map the far visual field. And then I'm going to discuss about the classic scene regions. Okay, first the setup. I should mention that we are not the first one to think about this wide-angle scanning. There are actually a couple of other groups who were able to project image up to 120 degrees. But these previous approaches have a lot of constraints that makes things even farther from the natural viewing experience, which is kind of the opposite of what we are aiming for. So we took a different approach, which was actually inspired by an infant fMRI by Cameron Ellis and colleagues. So here's what we did. First, we installed a pair of angled mirrors where the projected image comes through the pipe. And using this, we bounced off the image directly to the scanner. And then we removed the top head coil because it was blocking the peripheral view. And instead, yeah, we thought it was bold, but it's working. So, and instead, we replaced it with a custom-built screen that looks like this. So as you can see, it has a curved design. And so it wraps around the subject's head, covering almost the entire visual field. And so with this setup, we could achieve about 175-degree projection. But it turns out this physical setup was only half of the challenge. We noticed that there is a severe image distortion on the curved screen. So to correct this, we developed a computational method that warps an image in the reverse direction. And we also noticed that the image ratio really matters, especially the field of view of the camera that took the image is critical. So for some images without a compatible field of view, seeing them in the full field made subjects feel like a way taller or some kinds of very weird distorted perception of space. So for this, we generated all our stimuli using the custom-built virtual environments in Unity, where we can export images with wide field of view. Okay, now I'm going to show, I will show you how we map the far visual field using this setup. So for this, we showed participants in the scanner different sizes of flickering rings, which stimulates different parts of the visual field. And the radius of the rings range from smaller than 2 degrees to all the way up to 56 degrees and more. And this last condition was far enough that it mostly stimulates the monocular visual field beyond the typical binocular zone. Okay, here I'll show the results from the right hemisphere, and this is the view of partially inflated brain when you are looking from bottom to up. And if we rotate this, now we are seeing the medial view where you can see this parieto-occipital sulcus or POS. Okay, now I'm going to overlay the result by coloring each voxel based on its preference or the condition with the highest activation. First off, you can see that the smallest condition, colored in red, activated really a lot of cortex, even though it's a tiny small dot in the pixel space. And from that red regions, you can see really systematic progression of preference from the center to periphery, all the way up to the POS. And to give you some more context, this is the result from a similar protocol, but tested in the typical setup, so not full field. And you can see overall similar motif, but the pattern does not reach anywhere close to the POS. So these results clearly demonstrate that our wide-angle projection setup can stimulate the part of cortex that was not possible before. And we found consistent pattern across hemispheres and across all other subjects. Okay, now let's move on to the classic scene regions. As you know, there are 3 classic scene regions, which are usually defined by scene minus phase or scene minus object contrast. So in our full field setting, we follow this convention by contrasting the small size postcard scenes with the size matched faces. And using this contrast, we were able to successfully localize these regions. And then we ask how these regions respond as a function of eccentricity. And for this, we use the same stimuli that I showed before. So let's first think about some predictions. As noted in the previous talk, and also in many previous studies, it was shown that scene regions, especially the PPA, have clear preference for the peripheral stimuli. So we already kind of know that the activation will go up to some eccentricity. The real question is what happens at the far periphery that was not testable before. And here are some possibilities. First, maybe the activation will keep ramping up as it gets further, or maybe it will go up, then plateau once it gets far enough. Or maybe there is some kind of peak at some particular eccentricity. Okay, so what did we actually find? The PPA showed increasing activation, and then surprisingly, it dropped at the most peripheral condition. But in contrast, the RC showed increasing activation pattern as it gets farther. And as for the OPA, well, we didn't really find a clear pattern, which is kind of typical for this area. Okay, and then we wondered, okay, what about beyond these classic scene regions? So for this, we thought about how we can define the scene regions in the full field version. So as I mentioned before, a typical contrast is scene minus phase, and here we have the full field scene. So all we need to do was to contrast it with the full field phases. But what do we even mean by full field phases? Should we use a single phase? But it doesn't feel quite right because now the content and the retinotopy are confounded here. So we had to take a step back and rethink about this issue. So we did it by asking what does it mean to be a scene or how we can operationalize it. So the first option could be purely retinotopy based one. And within this framework, anything at the far periphery, either faces or object, could be a part of the scene. So this is kind of like embodied sense of a scene. And another option could be more content-based one. And within this framework, a scene has higher order image statistics or unique features that are distinguishable from the Phase-scrambled or other category images. Okay, so based on this, now we are going to look at 2 different contrasts. So when we look at when we compare the in-text and the Phase-scrambled scenes, which remove the high-level scene information, so makes it unrecognizable while maintaining other low-level visual properties. Oops. In this contrast, the retinotopy footprint is matched, but now the contents is different. And this is what we found. So this is the activation difference map between the 2 conditions, and overall the scene regions, as well as some lateral part of the high level visual areas, showing higher activation to the full field condition. And especially this difference was strongest and most robust at the PPA, and then OPA, and the RC was somewhat mixed, or this difference was weaker. And what about the full field and the postcard contrast? This contrast has the matched content, but different retinotopy footprint. And this is what we find. Here we see a strong activation of the far periphery preferring regions along the POS, but not much in the classic scene regions. Although there is some portion of the RC that does show some higher activation. So overall, this is complementing the result from the previous slide, and they together suggest that the classic scene regions really do capture the scene contents beyond the just far peripheral stimulation. And there's another interesting topographic observation from this contrast, which is that all scene regions are right adjacent to the far peripheral retinotopic cortex. So this is kind of connecting all three scene regions. We haven't figured out what it means yet, but it is certainly an intriguing finding that requires further investigation. Okay, to wrap up, first I talked about how we achieve the wide-angle projection in the scanner, then showed how extensively this setup can stimulate the visual cortex. And I also talked about some findings and insights about the classic scene regions. And lastly, the reason I'm really excited about this project is because this full field setup can have really some qualitative changes, like having more immersive visual experience, which can bring the subject from an outside observer to an agent who is present in the scene. And this could open up many interesting new research directions. And one example could be the study of body parts in the far periphery when presented with the realistic first-person view. And I'd like to conclude by acknowledging my collaborators and all members of the Vision Lab, former and the present, and of course, all of you for listening. Thank you.
Wonderful work. Could you comment a little bit on the impact of removing the head coil on your signal quality for the fMRI?
Yeah, that's something, that's a good question. We are definitely worried about that. So we did that, we made that decision based after consulting with our MR physicist who ran some quality assessment tests. So if you look at like the anatomical image, definitely you can see some signal drop. So frontal area is not clear. But as far as I can tell, the most of the visual cortex and some part of the parietal cortex, we didn't seem to lose that much signal.
I guess relatedly, do you have to do anything to make sure the participants aren't moving? Because usually the head coil helps you fix in there. So.
Yeah, we are still doing the head padding, so it helps them not moving their head. But also we made sure that when they first position, we have some like calibration display. So make sure that they are looking at the center dot and trying, yeah. So, and I don't think, not having the top head coil, I don't think that introduces any more possibility for the movement.
Thanks.